Ringraziamo molto.
We'd like to thank very much Abraham Burg. As you heard, we choose to open this session with his presentation. Was very appropriate choice that we have made, and that we're all called upon to look into what the actual situation is on the ground, look at the options which are before us today, so that we can convert into reality what is culturally and politically possible today. So I think that his realistic approach is not sort of supported by the optimism of willpower, but the concrete possibility of changing paradigm. And this is definitely an invitation, a strong invitation to all of us to think about this possibility. We now give the floor to HagaiEl Ad, who's the director of the Israeli Center for Human Rights, B'Tselem. You have the floor, Guy.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the organizers for initiating this. Thank you all for being here this morning, spending the day thinking and discussing this issue together. And I want to express my personal gratitude and admiration to Louisa for taking such good personal care of me during recent days. I don't know how many of you had the pleasure and also the challenge of trying to walk in Rome together with Louisa, but it's a very difficult task because people keep stopping her every 5 minutes because she runs into yet another person that loves her, admires her, and so on. So it takes a very long time to get from here to there, and yet somehow she succeeds in doing it on time. I'm speaking in English, which is not my first language, and many of us are listening to translation. And when I was studying English, I ran into this issue that maybe others here that have learned English have also been confronted with, which is the complication of tenses. Too many tenses in English. Present progressive, future perfect, past present, all these things. The past not really that present, and the future not that progressive, but and so very, very complicated. I always keep making mistakes in my usage of English tenses in this way. And I think that maybe, just maybe, this is not just my own personal problem, but a challenge that more people perhaps are dealing with and not dealing with that well. In what sense? In the sense that we keep asking ourselves all sorts of questions with regard to the reality in Israel-Palestine. And we ask these questions all the time using the future tense, right? There's a list of questions. I'm sure you're all familiar with at least some of them. What will we do if the occupation becomes permanent? What will we do if there's going to be formal annexation? What will we do if Israel stops being a democracy? What will we do if Palestinians in Gaza will march to the fence? What will we do if there won't be negotiations for 2 states? And so on and so forth. And of course, this list of questions also comes with this expectation for a formal announcement that someone will do us the courtesy of showing up one day with a very big sign and will tell us very kindly, that thing that you were asking about, that you were concerned about, that day that you think you were asking when it will come, actually it has arrived. Right? There will be a formal announcement, like this is the day that paradigm has expired. This is the day that occupation has become permanent, and so on and so forth. And what I want to suggest is that first, our usage of future tense, English future tense, in this fashion is not just a grammatical error, but in fact a factual error, simply a factual error. And all of these things have arrived. I'm not sure exactly when, at what exact moment between 1967 and this morning they have arrived, but they have arrived. And I guess also, as you've noticed, there was no official announcement of that specific moment. And of course, the absence of that official announcement is part of the strategy, part of the way that we have managed to get to this unfortunate reality which we are living under, and if I would speak more precisely, with which Palestinians are living under. So just a few examples. What will we do if the occupation becomes permanent, right? So, I mean, if you were a less gentler, a less kinder audience, then you might have started laughing at this point, because this is really not a very intelligent question to ask. 50 years doesn't strike normal people as temporary, right? So I don't know exactly at what point, like in anyone's personal relationships or whatever, you would think that something has become permanent, but I suspect that 100% of the people in this room would agree that at some point between 0 and 50 years, things stop being temporary. So again, I don't know what was the moment of formality in which temporariness has completely expired in the context of this reality, but we are way past that point by this moment. What will we do if Israel stops being a democracy? Well, a democracy is a reality in which all people that are under the authority of a state have a political voice and are part of the political process, part of the decision-making process. That's one of the attributes of democracy. It's not all of it, but that's an essential part of democracy. Of course, without representation, without political rights, there is no reason for any person of good faith to expect rule of law, to expect justice, to expect equality, to expect meaningful realizations of basic human rights. But in my country, we are already, for half a century, living a reality in which there are 13 million people, everyone between the river and the sea, are living under one form or another of Israeli control, whether you are in Gaza or in the West Bank or in Jerusalem or inside the Green Line in Israel proper. All of us, all 13 million of us, are living under one form or another of Israeli control, and yet only a fraction of us, about 8 million of us, who are Israeli citizens like myself, have political rights, participate in the political process, go to elections, vote, and decide on the future. And when we decide on the future, we decide not only on our future, but also on the future of Palestinians, repeatedly making these decisions, one election cycle after another, above their heads. And that is deeply, fundamentally undemocratic. And that is not a temporary reality as well. Most election cycles in Israel, most of them, since my country was founded in 1948, actually happened with this part of reality, 50 out of 70 years approximately. So if you're asking yourself, following the news of recent pieces of what's been known as anti-democratic legislation, shrinking space for civil society in Israel, and so on, and critiquing that and expressing, I think, rightful concern with regard to what does that mean with regard to Israeli democracy, then I embrace the questions, but I reject the last part of the sentence, because there is no such thing. Israel has not been a democracy already for a very long time, and again, not because the treatment of civil society organizations is becoming more hostile, more like Russia, more like Egypt, more like Hungary in recent years, but because of the fundamental issue of the denial of political rights for millions of people living under occupation for more than half a century already. And of course, what will we do if Palestinians will march to defense? Well, Palestinians have been doing exactly that every Friday since March 30. And you see what, you have a non-theoretical answer to that. They are met with live bullets. And by this point in time, there are not only dozens of fatalities in Gaza in response by Israel to these demonstrations, but more than 2,000 people, let that sink in, more than 2,000 Palestinians that have been shot by live ammunition, by Israeli soldiers from inside Israel firing into the blockaded Gaza Strip. More than 2,000 people. And what will we do if there will be formal annexation? Well, you know, the way Israel treats Area C, that 60% of the West Bank that was temporarily agreed upon in Oslo that will remain under Israeli control for 5 years and then actually stayed in that way for more than a generation, Israel already treats all of Area C as if it is absolutely ours. We already do whatever we want in Area C without formal annexation. So why are we so obsessed or ignoring the reality of what is actually happening on the ground de facto, day in and day out, with the excuse that in the absence of formal annexation, what is happening is actually acceptable, digestible, less horrific in some way? Why is there the denial of reality? Because that formal announcement hasn't arrived yet. So, as I was saying before, the fact that there was no formal announcement is not a coincidence. The strategy, Israeli strategy of trying to get to this point is a strategy that is aimed to always fly 2 inches below the level of international outrage. So you're always trying to identify how far and how fast you can go, but not pushing it too much too soon. And formal announcements actually might bring consequences. That's a good reason to continue just doing things de facto and not going through these formal announcements. That's good reason to occasionally pay the lip service for the two-state solution, because that also pushes against consequences, even though reality actually is continuing to go in the opposite direction. So what is needed in order for this reality to perpetuate itself is to successfully have it both ways, accomplish 2 things at the same time: perpetual occupation on the one hand, and no international consequences at the same time. And the way to accomplish that is through avoiding unnecessary official announcements of things that have already happened, in fact, in reality, but we are still somehow in partial denial with regard to them. It means that you do things gradually, you do things piecemeal, you do things 1 step at a time so that you don't get too much bad public relations, that you don't cross that level that might bring about international outrage. And you do things in a way that is always paying attention to providing a guise of legality to what we're doing to Palestinians. And that's also one of the unique aspects of Israel's oppression of Palestinians, that close attention to the letter of the law. Which means that you don't just send in the bulldozers. It means that before you do it, you actually cross the T's and dot the I's and allow Palestinians due process. And since we are the occupying power, we have almost all the patience in the world to let these things drag on for longer and longer and longer and longer, while on the other side, on the receiving end, what there are human beings, individuals, families, communities, often left to struggle on their own in the face of this enormous power of my country. And if you're not convinced to give up after a week, then maybe you will be convinced to give up after a month. And if not after a month, then after a year, not after a year, after a decade, and so on and so forth. We've already had a very long time. Imagine, again, half a century already of applying that continuous pressure over Palestinians so that we can gradually accomplish what we desire. And that is mostly expressing itself in the context of building settlements on the one hand and displacing Palestinians on the other hand. And these two motions of our advancing and their retreat always go hand in hand, and are being pursued in a very steadfast and strategic and coherent fashion for a very long time, and the results are all in front of our eyes. Just look at the recent maps of the West Bank, look at the situation developing in East Jerusalem, and you will see how far we've actually succeeded in accomplishing this goal that clearly has been internationally acceptable, because withstanding all of the statements of rejection, concern, condemnation, and so on, at the end of the day, reality is what we have, and clearly the world is accepting it, otherwise we would not have been here. And of course, this also has consequences with regard to international law. Now, I don't want to express the issue in the sense that, I'm not here as an international law expert, and my issue is not a theoretical commitment to international law. My issue is the realization of the rights of Palestinians and ending the occupation. But since all this is happening in a very well-known international context, then I think it is worth at least dedicating one paragraph to that issue. Israel is not the worst violator of human rights around the world, but Israel is uniquely positioned to cause harm to international law in ways in which other regimes are unable to do. In what way? Other countries that violate rights in ways much worse than what Israel does don't even bother to pretend that they're in compliance with international law in any way. And even if they would, no one would take them seriously, right? But what Israel does is unique in the sense that, as I've described, all this legal attention is being provided by Israel with the absolute insistence that what we are doing is in compliance with international law. So I mentioned Gaza and the way Israel responded to demonstrations in recent weeks and so on. Israel insists that everything that it is doing is absolutely legal, not only according to Israeli law, but also according to international standards. The building of settlements, the policy of displacing Palestinians from Area C, everything else, like the endless list. You give me the human rights violation, and we would provide you with the endless Israeli legal argumentation that insists that this is actually okay, including, unfortunately, no small number of decisions by Israel's High Court of Justice that have basically, most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, have accepted this reality and has helped provide a guise of legality to these systematic violations. So for those of you that are concerned about respect for international law, there's an essential need to realize that what Israel is doing is emptying international law from its principles, from its essence, from within, with the insistence that all this is with compliance with international law. And if that is allowed to go on, it has been allowed to go on for 50 years, then this is a terrible precedent that Palestinians are, the first ones on the receiving end of this reality, but the consequences of this may very well go much further than the reality in Israel-Palestine alone. Now, maybe some of you, maybe some of us have given some thought to, in this interplay between future and past and what will we do if this happens, but in fact maybe we realize that it has happened, but maybe we've played with ourselves in our minds this this thought experiment, right? If there would have been an official announcement that this and that has happened, one or all of the questions I presented at the beginning of my remarks, then this is what we would do. This is what our response would have been as activists, as elected officials, as governments, as the international community. If the red line were to have been crossed, maybe, I'm not sure this was the correct usage of the tense, then this is the effective, this would have been the strong reaction by the international community that would have pushed back against the crossing of that red line. And with great sadness, I have to say what is obvious, that even though all of these things have actually happened, they were not met with an effective international response that basically would have said to Israel, we do not accept this. Like, we reject this reality, and we reject this reality not only in language, but we reject this reality in action. And this is going to have consequences, and you, Israel, will need to make up your mind whether you want to continue occupying Palestine or whether you want to deal with the consequences. But you cannot continue enjoying this reality of perpetual occupation with no consequences. That deal has actually never been taken off the table by the international community. And of course, the first and foremost responsibility for the way things are lies with the people that are there, with Israelis, with Palestinians, of course, no question about that. But I'm here in a room in Italy, and it's impossible not to discuss the international responsibility for this reality and the specific European responsibility for this reality. So sometimes people in Europe would respond and say, well, you know, we don't have the leverage. Only the Americans would have the leverage. And it's true that the US certainly has more leverage than Europe, but you don't necessarily have to have the most leverage in order to have an impact. And of course, Europe, as the European Union, for instance, as Israel's #1 trade partner, has all the leverage needed in the world in order to inform the Israeli public that the deal is off the table and we need to make up our mind whether we're continuing this way or whether we are opting to deal with the consequences. And the repeated European decision not to use this leverage, and don't be mistaken, a decision, even if it's not announced, but the decision not to act is also a decision. And that silence, of course, speaks volumes and is heard very well every day in every election cycle, again, by the Israeli public. The decision not to act tells us that the sweet deal is still on the table, that the international community is continuing to accept it, that Europe is continuing to accept it. And just in the context of trade relations between the European Union and Israel, then of course it's impossible to ignore Article 2 of the association agreement between the EU and Israel that says that the entire basis for the relationship are the shared values of human rights and democracy. And of course, there is nothing shared between human rights and democracy and perpetual occupation of another people for half a century. So the values clearly are not shared anymore, and yet the association agreement stands and not challenged, and so on, which again sends the same message, the message of acceptance, of acquiescence of the world, of Europe, with this reality. Now, what the Israeli right is betting on, and at least in recent years it seems that the winds of history are on their side, is that the values will be shared again, but just in the opposite direction, not in the way that I would wish, not in the sense that values shared of human rights and democracy, but no, what the Israeli right is thinking about, fantasizing, and in some ways seeing the gradual realization of that is exactly the opposite, that values of rule of law, equality, human rights will decrease, will be defeated, also in Europe, also in North America, elsewhere around the world, and then once again, the values will be shared, but in the opposite direction, not the kinds of values that we would want to see shared. And this is another example in which the future of what happens in Israel-Palestine is interconnected with the future of what happens in Europe. And defeat of these values in Israel-Palestine is a terrible message, first and foremost, of course, for Palestinians, again, on the receiving end of this reality. Also a terrible message for Israelis that do care, do wish to see a present and a future of justice and equality. And it's a terrible message also for Europeans. It's going to support the negative process that we're seeing in Hungary, in this country, in other countries, and so on and so forth. But we should all bear in mind that as much as the winds of history are blowing in that general direction in recent years, and especially during the last year since the elections in the US, it is not preordained that this is going to be the future for the next generation, for the next 50 years. We don't know that. The pendulum may very well swing back, and hopefully will swing back much sooner than what the right is planning for. Which also means that the realization of these values successfully in Israel-Palestine would be a hugely, immensely significant accomplishment that would resonate in the most positive way, again, first and foremost for Palestinians, that for the first time in half a century, forever, will be able to enjoy justice and freedom, but also will resonate very strongly in Europe. It will be a positive example that could benefit all of us in support of living the kind of values that we want to see, living the kind of values that were an essential aspect, even if deeply imperfectly realized, but an essential part of the post-World War II order that we have cherished for such a long time. I'm going to say just two closing remarks, and after that we'll see, hopefully will be technically possible, we'll look at a short video clip produced by B'Tselem, actually in Italian. First time in our history that we have official content in Italian. And that clip focuses on one specific issue, the issue of forcible transfer. Israeli policy aimed to displace Palestinian communities inside the West Bank. But before we switch to the video clip, I just want to offer two thoughts looking forward. One is, I had this list of questions in the beginning and said, you know, all of these things already happened in the past. Maybe not all of you were completely convinced. So what I would do then is invite, I accept that. And then I would just like politely invite you to look forward, and since the processes are very gradual and there are no official announcements and so on, and if you don't pay attention, you will blink and 20 more years will pass, and we will still not have decided or agreed that the moment already has arrived and we didn't notice. So what I would invite you instead of that is to make up your own mind of what is the expiration date. Take a piece of paper, and even if you accept that this is temporary, even if you accept that some things have not arrived yet, then take a piece of paper and say, you know, okay, 50 years and a half, not temporary, still temporary, fine. Take a piece of paper, write on it 55 years, write on it 52 years, write on it 70 years, whatever, right? And don't lose that piece of paper, so that it could be a reminder for yourself, because that's the announcement. There is not going to be probably an official announcement. But that will be for you, the personal announcement, that that moment has happened. And then I would hope that it will also trigger for you personally what would be a meaningful moral response to this unjust, unacceptable reality. What were you to do if that moment would have to arrive? Do that when you meet that piece of paper that you have written for yourself with regard to that. And the other thought, the other invitation at this time in which there's no peace process to obscure our thinking or to provide another guise for this continuous reality, to invite you to focus on something that is not theoretical, not dependent in any way on the existence of an Israeli partner for negotiations, a Palestinian partner for negotiations, all of these complicated issues that I know nothing about, and to invite you just to focus on the factual reality and the injustices that are a daily part of it, and ask yourself what you can do, regardless of the presence or absence of the peace process, in order to support justice, to support human rights, and not to allow this reality to continue in that fashion. And with that, hopefully we'll be able to see the video clip now.